The thermometer outside Bjorn Eriksson's cabin read -28 degrees, but inside his feet stayed warm against the floorboards while other trappers 3 miles away huddled around dying fires with frozen toes. The difference wasn't better wood or a bigger fireplace, it was what he'd buried 6 feet beneath the snow. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The cabin floor felt like ice against Bjorn Eriksson's bare feet, even though the fireplace roared hot enough to make the stones glow orange. He stood there, in his wool socks, January cold, seeping up through the pine boards, and watched his brother Olaf huddle closer to the fire with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Outside, the Montana Territory winter of 1836 held the mountains in a grip that hadn't loosened since November. Inside, heat rose straight up the chimney while cold air settled on the floor like an invisible lake. Bjorn was 29 years old that winter. He had left Norway 5 years earlier with Olaf, who was 3 years younger, and they had worked their way west through debt and labor until they had enough supplies to try trapping. This was their second winter in the mountains, working beaver streams in the drainage that fed into the Yellowstone River. They had built their cabin the previous summer using methods every trapper knew: cut logs, notch the corners, stack them 8 feet high, fill the gaps with moss and mud, lay a plank floor, build a fireplace, cover it with a pole and bark roof. The structure kept out wind and rain. It kept out snow. But it did not keep out cold. The cabin sat on corner posts, elevated 18 inches above the ground to prevent rot from moisture and snowmelt. Standard practice, sensible construction. But those 18 inches created a crawl space where winter air pooled and froze, turning the floor into a sheet of thermal loss. Bjorn burned enough wood each day to heat 3 cabins, and still his toes went numb after sundown. Olaf's feet had started showing white patches 2 weeks ago. Frostbite, mild but spreading. They kept his feet wrapped in rabbit fur. They kept the fire burning day and night. Nothing helped. Bjorn understood fire. He understood heat rose and cold sank. He had watched smoke climb straight up a chimney in calm air. He had felt warm air accumulate near the ceiling while his ankles froze. The cabin was designed backwards, he thought, but he did not know how to fix it. Every mountain cabin he had ever seen shared the same problem. Cold floors were simply part of winter survival. You wore thick socks. You kept your boots on. You accepted it. Olaf coughed, a wet sound that had been getting worse for 3 days. He was sitting as close to the fire as he could without burning himself, and still he shivered. Bjorn added another log to the flames, felt the heat blast his face while his feet stayed cold. The wood supply outside was running low. They would need to cut more in 2 days, maybe 3. The work was brutal in deep snow. Everything about mountain winters was brutal. Bjorn pulled on his boots and stepped outside to bring in more firewood. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath. The thermometer he had mounted on the cabin wall read -12 degrees. He loaded his arms with split pine and hurried back inside. When he closed the door, Olaf was lying down near the fire, the blanket pulled over his head. His feet, wrapped in fur, extended toward the flames. Those feet would be the beginning of everything. The blizzard hit on February 11th, with winds that shook the cabin walls and snow that fell so thick Bjorn could not see the woodpile 10 feet from the door. He brought in every piece of split wood he could carry and stacked it inside. By noon, the drifts had buried the lower 3 feet of the cabin walls. By evening, the temperature had dropped to -20 degrees. By midnight, Olaf was delirious with fever. The frostbite on his feet had turned black 3 days earlier. Bjorn had tried everything he knew. He had warmed the feet gradually. He had applied poultices made from pine resin and bear fat. He had kept them wrapped and elevated. Nothing stopped the infection that crept up from the damaged tissue. Now Olaf lay on his sleeping platform, shaking with chills despite 2 blankets and the fire that Bjorn fed constantly. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Bjorn burned wood faster than he had ever burned it, trying to keep the cabin warm enough to help his brother survive. The fireplace consumed logs hourly. The stones glowed red. Heat poured up the chimney and gathered near the ceiling, while the floor stayed brutally cold. Bjorn could feel the cold air sinking, pooling, stealing warmth from everything it touched. He moved Olaf's platform closer to the fire. It made no difference. The cold came from below, relentless and patient. On the second day, Bjorn realized they were going to run out of wood before the storm ended. He rationed the fire, letting it burn lower, trying to stretch the supply. Olaf's shivering got worse. The fever peaked and broke and peaked again. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Bjorn knelt beside the platform and held his brother's hand and felt how cold the skin was, despite the blankets and the fire, and every desperate attempt to generate warmth. Olaf died on the 3rd night, February 14th, while the blizzard still raged outside. Bjorn sat beside the body until dawn, feeding the fire mechanically, watching heat rise and disappear while cold settled on the floor like water filling a well. His brother had frozen to death inside a cabin with a fire burning 6 feet away. The realization felt unreal and absolutely clear at the same time. When the storm finally cleared on February 15th, Bjorn went outside into a landscape transformed by snow. Drifts reached the cabin's roofline on the north side. The sky was clear and brutally cold, -18 degrees in full sunlight. He could not bury Olaf. The ground was frozen solid beneath 4 feet of snow. He wrapped the body in canvas and placed it in the crawl space beneath the cabin floor, where the cold would preserve it until spring thaw allowed proper burial. Bjorn stood in the snow afterward and looked at his cabin and understood something that would consume him for the next 6 months. Heat rises. Cold sinks. He had built the cabin backwards. The heat needed to be below. Spring came slowly to the Montana Territory in 1837. Bjorn buried Olaf on April 23rd on a hillside above the creek where they had trapped beaver together. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in the cabin, unable to sleep, listening to meltwater drip from the roof. By May, the streams were running high and the beaver were active. Bjorn ran his trap lines alone and processed the pelts mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He thought constantly about cold and heat and the way cabins were built. Every structure he had seen followed the same pattern. Elevated floors, open crawl spaces, heat sources inside that sent warmth straight up and out. Nobody questioned it because nobody had a better method. But Bjorn could not stop questioning it now. Cold air sank. That was physics, not opinion. Building a warm room on top of a pool of cold air seemed as logical as trying to keep water in a bucket with no bottom. In early June, Bjorn took his spring catch of pelts to the trading post at the junction of 2 rivers, a 3-day journey on horseback. The post was run by a man named Samuel Bridger, no relation to the famous trapper, who had built a substantial log structure with a stone foundation and a proper roof. Bjorn sold his furs for a fair price and restocked his basic supplies: powder, lead, coffee, salt, flour. While Bridger tallied the account, Bjorn asked if he could store some of his heavier supplies in the root cellar rather than transport them back to his cabin immediately. Bridger agreed and led him to the cellar entrance, a slanted door built into the ground behind the trading post. They descended stone steps into a chamber dug 8 feet below the surface. The cellar was perhaps 12 feet square, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved foods and goods protected from temperature extremes. What struck Bjorn immediately was the temperature. Outside, the June afternoon was warm, approaching 70 degrees. Down in the cellar, the air felt cool and stable, perhaps 55 degrees. Bjorn set down his supplies and ran his hand along the stone wall. The rocks were cool to the touch, but not cold. He looked up at the ceiling, studying the construction. Heavy beams supported planks that held back the earth above. The cellar stayed cool in summer, Bridger explained, and never froze in winter. Something about being below the frost line. The earth at that depth maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. Bjorn asked questions. How deep was the frost line? Around 6 feet in this region. Why did stone stay warmer than wood? Stone held heat longer, released it slower. Thermal mass, some educated travelers called it. Did the trading post stay warmer in winter than cabins? Bridger admitted it did, noticeably so, especially the rooms above the stone foundation. Bjorn left the trading post that afternoon with his mind working through calculations and possibilities. Underground was warmer, stone held heat. The earth itself could be insulation instead of enemy. He rode back toward the mountains with the beginning of a plan taking shape. Bjorn returned to his cabin in mid-June and spent 2 weeks finishing the spring trapping season. By early July, when the beaver pelts were no longer prime and the work slowed, he began scouting locations for a new cabin. He found a spot half a mile from his old structure on higher ground with good drainage and clear sight lines. The location was less convenient to the creek, but better for what he had planned. He marked the perimeter with stakes. 20 feet long, 16 feet wide, large enough for one man to live comfortably through long winters. Then he started digging. The work began on July 8, 1837. Bjorn excavated the trench where the main heating chamber would sit, directly beneath where the cabin floor would eventually rest. He dug a rectangle 30 feet long and 4 feet wide, oriented east to west to match the cabin's planned footprint. The first 2 feet of soil came away easily, dark earth, rich with decomposed plant matter. The next foot was harder, mixed with rocks and clay. Below 3 feet, he hit dense glacial till packed with stones. He worked from dawn until the heat of midday drove him to rest in the shade. He resumed in late afternoon and worked until darkness made it impossible to see the bottom of the trench. Each day he dug deeper, 4 feet down, 5 feet. The walls had to be cut straight and stable. Any collapse would bury him and end the project and his life simultaneously. He shored up the walls with pine boards as he descended, temporary supports that would come out later when the stone lining went in. At 5.5 feet deep, he hit groundwater, a spring seeping from the western end of the trench, not heavy but persistent. Bjorn spent 2 days digging a drainage channel that angled down and away from the main excavation, leading the water out to a low spot 30 feet distant. He lined the drainage channel with rocks to keep it open. The flow diminished to a trickle, manageable. By late July, the trench reached 6 feet deep along its entire length. Bjorn climbed out one evening and stood looking at what he had created. A rectangular pit in the earth, 30 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, with vertical walls and a level floor. The amount of soil he had moved was staggering. He had carried it out 1 shovel load at a time and spread it in a berm around the excavation site. Matthias Keller, a German trapper whose cabin was 3 miles south, rode past one afternoon and stopped to watch Bjorn work. He sat on his horse and looked down into the trench and asked what exactly Bjorn thought he was doing. Digging a grave? Planning to live underground like a badger? Bjorn straightened his back and leaned on his shovel and said he was building a root cellar. Keller laughed and rode away, shaking his head. That night, Bjorn slept soundly for the first time since Olaf died. August brought heat that made physical labor nearly unbearable by midday, but Bjorn worked through it. The trench was excavated. Now came the stonework that would transform a hole in the ground into a thermal battery capable of storing heat for days. He needed rocks, hundreds of them, flat rocks, uniform rocks, rocks that would stack and fit together with minimal gaps. He found them in the creek bed half a mile away. Bjorn spent the first week of August hauling stones. He used a travois made from pine poles and rawhide, dragging loads of 50 to 70 pounds each trip. The creek had deposited centuries of water-smoothed river rock in sizes from fist-sized to boulders weighing over 100 pounds. He selected carefully flat faces, consistent thickness, hard granite and basalt that would not crack from repeated heating and cooling. He rejected soft sandstone and anything with visible cracks. By August 10th, he had stockpiled enough stone to begin construction. The mortar came next. Bjorn dug clay from a deposit near the creek, where the bank cut deep and exposed a gray layer untouched by organic material. He mixed it with sand from a dry wash and water until it reached the consistency of thick mud. Then he added his secret ingredient, crushed limestone that he had burned in a fire pit for 2 days until it transformed into quicklime. The lime made the mortar set harder and bond stronger to the stone. He had seen this technique used on a church foundation in St. Louis years earlier. He started laying stone on August 12th. The first course went on the trench floor, the largest and flattest rocks positioned carefully to create a level base. He set each stone in mortar, tapped it level, and moved to the next. The work was slow and exacting. A wall that leaned or bulged would eventually collapse under the weight of earth and cabin above. By the end of the first day, he had completed 8 feet of the first course. The walls rose incrementally. Second course, third course, fourth. Bjorn worked with a plumb line, checking vertical alignment constantly. Each stone had to be positioned to distribute weight evenly. He filled gaps with smaller stones and mortar, leaving no voids where air could circulate and steal heat. The thickness of the walls varied from 10 inches at the base to 8 inches at the top, tapering slightly inward to add stability. At 4 feet of height, he began constructing the arched ceiling. He built wooden forms, curved supports that would hold the stone arch until the mortar cured. The arch was critical. It had to support the weight of earth above and distribute that weight to the walls rather than collapsing inward. He laid stone in a curve, each piece cut or selected to fit the radius. The keystone went in on September 2nd. He left the wooden supports in place for 5 days while the mortar cured, then carefully removed them. The arch held. September arrived with cooler nights that reminded Bjorn winter would return in less than 3 months. The underground stone chamber was complete. A buried fortress 30 feet long and 4 feet wide, with walls that would absorb and hold heat, like no wooden structure could. Now he had to build the cabin above it and connect the 2 systems in a way that would move warmth from fire to stone to living space without losing efficiency. He started with the cabin floor, but not in the traditional way. Most trappers built floors on posts elevated above ground. Bjorn's floor would sit only 2 feet above the stone ceiling of his underground chamber. He laid heavy beams across the top of the trench, spanning from undisturbed earth on one side to undisturbed earth on the other. The beams were pine logs a foot in diameter, notched where they crossed to lock together. On top of these, he laid split planks, fitted tight and smooth. Before he completed the floor, he cut 4 openings. Each opening was 10 inches square, positioned at intervals along the length of the room. He framed these openings with reinforced wood and fitted them with hinged grates made from small branches lashed together. The grates could be opened to allow heat to rise from the chamber below, or closed to contain it underground when needed. This was the key to the entire system. Controllable heat flow. The cabin walls went up using logs he had cut and stripped in July. He notched the corners carefully and chinked the gaps with a mixture of clay, moss, and pine resin. The structure was 16 feet wide and 20 feet long, matching the footprint of the underground chamber beneath. He built it solid and tight, but the walls were not the innovation. What happened below the floor was what mattered. The fireplace was where Bjorn's design became truly revolutionary. He built it at the east end of the cabin using flat stones mortared together. But instead of starting the firebox at floor level, he extended the foundation down through the floor and into the underground chamber. The firebox itself sat at floor level where he could feed it and cook, but the stones beneath it descended 4 feet into the chamber below, creating a massive heat sink of stone that would radiate warmth directly into the underground space. The chimney rose normally, venting smoke up and out through the roof. But the base, the foundation of fire-heated stone, lived in the chamber where heat would be trapped and stored. When fire burned in the firebox, the stones beneath would heat to temperatures exceeding 200 degrees. That heat would radiate outward into the surrounding stone walls. The chamber would become an oven, and that heat would rise through the floor grates into the living space above. Bjorn built an access tunnel from the underground chamber to the surface, angling up at 30 degrees and emerging 15 feet from the cabin's north wall. He lined this tunnel with stone and fitted it with a heavy wooden door at the exterior entrance. The cabin was finished by September 28th. Bjorn moved his supplies in and spent 2 days organizing the interior space. Sleeping platform against the west wall, storage shelves mounted high, table and bench near the fireplace, everything arranged with the careful attention of a man who would spend months alone in this space. On October 1st, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees overnight, the first real cold of autumn. Time to test the system. Bjorn built a fire in the fireplace that evening, nothing excessive, just a normal fire using split pine and a few larger logs. He let it burn for 3 hours while he ate dinner and prepared his gear for the next day's trapline check. The fire warmed the cabin quickly. Heat rose and gathered near the ceiling as it always did. But something else was happening beneath the floor. He opened one of the floor grates and felt the air below. Warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than it had been an hour earlier. He went outside through the cold darkness and walked to the access tunnel entrance. He opened the heavy door and descended into the underground chamber carrying a candle. The air inside felt warm against his skin. He held his hand near the stone wall. The rocks were warm to the touch, not burning hot, but warmer than body temperature. The heat from the fireplace was radiating down through the firebox foundation and spreading through the stone mass exactly as he had planned. He returned to the cabin and let the fire burn down to coals, then to ash. By midnight, the firebox was cold. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees. Inside the cabin, with no active fire, the temperature held at 48 degrees. Bjorn lay on his sleeping platform and felt warmth rising through the floor grates. Gentle, steady warmth coming from tons of heated stone 6 feet below him. He slept without adding wood to the fire. When he woke at dawn, frost covered the outside of the window. The thermometer read 18 degrees. Inside, the temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, a 24-degree differential maintained overnight with zero active heating. His feet were warm against the floorboards. Over the next 3 weeks, Bjorn refined the system. He learned that a hot fire burned for 2 hours would heat the stone mass enough to keep the cabin comfortable for 12 hours. He discovered that closing some floor grates while leaving others open created better air circulation. He found that the access tunnel needed to stay sealed during cold weather to prevent heat loss through that opening. By late October, he had the system calibrated. He burned fire primarily in the evening, heating the stone mass fully. Overnight and through the following day, stored heat radiated up through the floor. Wood consumption dropped to half what he had burned the previous winter. The floor stayed warm continuously. There were no cold spots, no frozen corners, no ice forming on the inside walls. Friedrich Vogel stopped by in early November. The winter of 1837 progressed with normal cold and occasional snow, but nothing tested the limits of Bjorn's heating system until January 18, 1838. The sky turned gray that morning with a peculiar flat light that experienced mountain men recognized as blizzard warning. By noon, snow was falling in thick curtains. By evening, the wind had risen to a howl that shook the cabin walls. The temperature dropped from 15 degrees to -8 in 3 hours. Bjorn sealed the access tunnel door from inside the cabin, blocking the only potential heat leak in his system. He built a large fire and fed it steadily for 4 hours, heating the underground stone mass as hot as he could make it. The firebox stones glowed dull red. Heat poured through the floor grates until the cabin interior reached 68 degrees, almost uncomfortable. Then he let the fire die completely and settled in to wait. The blizzard intensified through the night. Wind drove snow horizontally, burying the north side of the cabin under drifts that reached the roofline. The temperature outside plummeted, -15 degrees, -22. By dawn on January 19th, the thermometer outside read -28 degrees, the coldest Bjorn had ever recorded. Inside, the cabin held at 52 degrees with no fire burning. The storm continued without pause. Day 2, Day 3. Bjorn burned a fire only once on the second day, recharging the stone mass. He conserved wood, knowing the blizzard might last a week. The system worked exactly as he had designed it. Heat stored in tons of stone radiated upward slowly and steadily. The floor stayed warm. The air temperature dropped gradually but never reached dangerous levels. On the 4th day, Bjorn let the fire stay cold entirely, testing the absolute limit of his thermal battery. Outside, the temperature held steady at -32 degrees, the coldest reading yet. Winds continued at 40 miles per hour, creating wind chill far below survivable levels. Inside, with no fire for 24 hours, the cabin temperature stabilized at +4 degrees, a 36-degree differential maintained by stored heat alone. Bjorn slept comfortably under 2 blankets. His feet stayed warm against the floor. He melted snow for water using residual heat from the floor grates. He ate cold meals and read by candlelight and waited for the storm to break. On the 6th day, January 24th, the wind finally stopped. The sky cleared to brutal blue. The temperature was -26 degrees in full sunlight. Bjorn dug his way out through a drift that had buried his door. The landscape was transformed, sculpted by wind into flowing waves of white. He checked his wood supply, still adequate. Then he snowshoed 3 miles to check on Matthias Keller. Keller's cabin was abandoned, the door frozen open, the interior filled with drifted snow. Tracks led south toward the trading post, 5 days old and partially filled. Keller had fled during the storm. 2 weeks later, word reached the area that Seamus McKenna had frozen to death. Friedrich Vogel returned to the area in April of 1838. He was a German immigrant, 42 years old, who had been trapping the mountains for 6 years. He had heard about the blizzard and about Seamus McKenna's death, and about how Bjorn Eriksson had survived 6 days of -30-degree cold in comfort. Vogel wanted to see the cabin that made such survival possible. Bjorn showed him everything. They descended into the underground chamber through the access tunnel. Vogel ran his hands along the stone walls and stood in the center of the arched ceiling and asked detailed questions about excavation depth, stone selection, mortar composition, and heat transfer principles. He examined the fireplace foundation that extended down into the chamber. He studied the floor grates and the ventilation design. He took notes in a small journal. Vogel asked if he could build a similar system. Bjorn said yes and offered to help. They selected a site 2 miles from Bjorn's cabin, where Vogel had been planning to build anyway. The excavation began in May. Bjorn worked alongside Vogel for 3 weeks, teaching him the techniques that mattered. How deep to dig, how to line the trench, how to build the arch, how to integrate the fireplace. Vogel was a careful student. His trench system was completed by late July. His cabin was finished by September. That winter, Vogel's system worked as well as Bjorn's. Word spread through the scattered trapping community like smoke through forest. Duncan MacLeod, a Scottish trader who traveled between camps buying furs, stopped at both cabins during his winter rounds. He saw the warmth. He felt the heated floors. He asked permission to share the design with others. Bjorn agreed freely. He wanted no payment and no credit. He simply wanted people to stop freezing to death in cabins with fires burning. Over the next 2 years, 11 trappers and settlers built underground heating systems. Some built full trenches like Bjorn's original design. Others built partial systems, smaller chambers that provided less heat but required less work. A few built networks of connected chambers, creating complex thermal storage that could hold heat for days. The specific designs varied based on individual needs and available labor, but the principle remained constant. Store heat below the floor in stone mass, let it radiate upward, stop fighting against physics. The winter of 1839 brought temperatures as cold as the previous year. Not a single person with a properly built trench system suffered cold-related injury. The comparison was stark. Traditional cabins required constant fire maintenance and still left occupants vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia. Trench-heated cabins maintained comfortable temperatures with half the wood consumption and a quarter of the labor. Matthias Keller returned to his cabin in spring of 1839. He had spent the previous winter at the trading post, paying for shelter and food, burning through his profits. He was embarrassed but pragmatic. He rode to Bjorn's cabin in June and asked if the offer to help still stood. Bjorn said yes. They spent 5 weeks retrofitting Keller's existing cabin with a partial trench system. Bjorn Eriksson left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1844. The fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction across much of the Rockies, and silk had replaced beaver felt in hat manufacturing back east. The economic foundation of the mountain man era was crumbling. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness were returning to civilization or pushing further west to Oregon and California. Bjorn chose Oregon. He sold his cabin and trap lines to a young prospector and rode west with a mule train of settlers. In Oregon's Willamette Valley, he bought land and built a small ranch. He married Ingrid Sorensen in 1846, a Norwegian immigrant woman he met at a church social. They had 4 children over the next 8 years. Bjorn raised cattle and grew wheat and never spoke much about his years in the mountains. His children knew their father had been a trapper once, but the details of that life remained vague and distant. The cabin Bjorn built remained occupied for another 12 years. The prospector who bought it lived there through 3 winters, then sold it to a settler family moving into the territory. The family stayed 5 years before moving to a mining camp. The cabin sat empty after that, slowly weathering, but structurally sound. The underground chamber remained intact, its stone walls and arched ceiling still perfect after 2 decades. The Montana gold rush of the 1850s and 60s brought thousands of prospectors and settlers into the territory. They found abandoned cabins scattered through the mountains, remnants of the fur trade era. Some of these cabins had unusual features: stone-lined chambers beneath the floors, access tunnels leading underground, fireplace foundations that extended down into carefully constructed vaults. The new arrivals did not always understand what they had found, but they recognized superior construction. Several of these cabins were reoccupied and remained in use for years. The heating technique spread beyond its origins. Miners building permanent camps adopted variations of the underground thermal storage system. Military outposts in Wyoming and Idaho used modified designs for barracks and supply buildings. The principle became part of frontier building knowledge, passed from person to person without fanfare or formal documentation. Build below the frost line. Use stone for thermal mass. Capture and store heat. Simple concepts that saved lives in country where winter could kill. Bjorn Eriksson died on his Oregon ranch in 1871 at the age of 64. His wife and children buried him in a cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, his birth year, and the year of his death. Nothing about mountains or innovations or the cold that had killed his brother and driven him to dig 6 feet into frozen earth, searching for a better way. In the mountains, stone chambers built decades earlier still stood beneath collapsed cabin ruins. Modern archaeologists would eventually discover some of these sites and recognize the sophisticated engineering they represented. But that recognition came a century too late to record the name of the Norwegian trapper who first refused to accept that winter cold was simply something people had to endure.